Afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Aruna Pujari, and at the outset, I would like to thank the Asia Pacific Congress of Clinical Microbiology and Infection and BD for giving me an opportunity to be here. The topic given to me today is trends in superinfections in COVID-19 patients and the role of microbiology. I'm mainly going to share the Indian experience from our side. We know that the SARS-CoV-2 virus causes the disease COVID-19, which is spread through droplets, fomites, and airborne in closed situations. The incubation period is about 5 days, and the disease presents as mild, moderate, and severe clinical presentations. And an important aspect of the whole COVID-19 disease has been the presence of co-infections and superinfections. Some experience with this we have already had with the flu viruses as well as the MERS-CoV. Um, as regards India, as you see from this WHO dashboard, we've had about 4.5 lakh deaths, 2 waves, and as is seen here, the wave 2 in 2021 was much bigger than wave 1. So a lot of disease and the pandemic continues here in India as well as is globally. So what are these super infections and how are they associated with COVID? Super infections are also secondary infections. They could be nosocomial or hospital acquired infections, or they're simply opportunistic infections that occur during the care of a COVID-19 patient. These could be bacterial, viral, fungal, or parasitic, and they cause infections at various sites like blood, lung, urine, skin, and soft tissue, and so on. Now, what is the significance of these super infections in COVID-19? They're directly responsible for excess morbidity, excess admissions into hospitals, increased length of stay, increased cost of therapy, both medical and surgical therapies, increased mortality, and the increased and prolonged use of broad spectrum antimicrobial agents, which has direct effects on our antimicrobial stewardship programs. Now, COVID-19 as a disease, we know that the SARS-CoV-2 virus is inhibitory or suppressive to the primary cells of the immune system, like the dendritic cells, as well as the natural killer cells, in addition to the suppression of T cells as well as B cells. And in turn, a lot of cytokines get produced, and as a result of it, there's a lot of inflammation and immunosuppression that goes hand in hand because of SARS-CoV-2 and its impact on the immune system. But apart from that, are there any other risk factors which might be responsible for these secondary infections that we encounter with COVID-19? So Vidal et al. From Italy studied these risk factors and found that immunomodulatory treatment, which includes the use of steroids, increased length of stay in the hospital, and ICU admissions are some of the contributing factors for increased number of hospital-acquired infections amongst these COVID-19 patients. So looking towards India, this is one of the largest studies of secondary infections in hospitalized COVID-19 patients from India, which was done at 10 tertiary care institutions in India, and more than 17,000 patients were studied. And this group found 56% of patients developing secondary infections, and the mortality was close to 11%. And look at the different types of organisms that were isolated. Klebsiella, Acinetobacter, Pseudomonas, E. coli were the predominant organisms. There were around 6% of Candida also. Where were these organisms isolated from? Majority of them were from blood and the respiratory specimens. And what was alarming was that the carbapenem resistant gram negative bacteria were close to 74%, which makes them very difficult pathogens to treat, and therefore worse outcomes. Another study from North India, it's a single center study where they also looked at COVID-19 patients with secondary infections and found that those with age more than 50, those in the ICU had naturally worse outcomes. Apart from that, amongst the bacteria, once again, Acinetobacter and Klebsiella pneumoniae were the two common pathogens that they isolated. And not surprising, the resistant profiles had 9% of these strains being resistant to colistin, and 64 and 69% of these strains being resistant to carbapenems, which again goes into the XDR group of organisms and therefore difficult to treat. What has been our experience, both in 2020 as well as right up to September 21, we've seen a whole lot of pneumonias and pneumonias with secondary BSIs. They have been our primary secondary infections, followed by bloodstream infections, as is seen here. And with respect to the organisms, Acinetobacter baumannii and Klebsiella pneumoniae are our predominant pathogens. And clearly from this, as you see, most of them are XDR, meaning that they are meropenem resistant or carbapenem resistant. As a result of which, we actually tend to use more of colistin and other salvage drugs for treatment of these organisms. And in turn, we had breakthrough infections with E. colistin intrinsically resistant pathogens like Stenotrophomonas maltophilia and Elizabethingia meningosepticum. And other institutions in India also saw this particular trend. So implications of these secondary bacterial infections are basically high mortality, increase in the use of broad spectrum antimicrobial use, which in turn drives AMR. And therefore, infection prevention and control measures seem to be very, very important. Hand hygiene, environmental disinfection, care of devices, isolation policy, infusion practices need to be strengthened in order that outbreaks don't happen in amongst these critically ill patients. The next set of common superinfections seen with COVID-19 are the fungal superinfections. So they could be invasive candidiasis or other yeasts, as we will see, pulmonary aspergillosis, and the COVID-associated mucormycosis have been described. With regards to invasive candidiasis, while the common risk factors for invasive candidiasis like diabetes, renal failure, abdominal surgery, parenteral nutrition, long ICU stays continue to be important, there are certain specific COVID-19 risk factors for invasive candidiasis that have been described, like extracorporeal membrane therapy, corticosteroid therapy, and the severe damage to the alveolar epithelium due to SARS-CoV-2. And there are studies from India where they have noted that this is a study from Delhi where 2.5% of their patients, ICU patients, had invasive candidiasis. Of this, 10%, 10 patients had Candida auris, and there was 60% fatality in this group of patients with Candida auris fungemia. And they also observed persistent fungemia in 4 out of 6 patients, despite the fact that these were all on micafungin therapy for more than 5 days. There was 70% multi-drug resistance amongst these Candida auris. Overall, the mortality was about 53%. And this group also found extensive contamination of the hospital environment, further laying stress that IPC practices need to be strengthened in settings of COVID-19. Our own experience also is very similar. We've had Candida auris as a predominant pathogen, followed by Trichosporon asahi and Candida tropicalis, glabrata, parapsilosis, and albicans. And the mortality is almost 73%. Looking at the Trichosporon asahi superinfections that we had 3 cases. All of them were age more than 60. The ICU length of stay was more than 2 weeks. The third patient also had been in another ICU and was transferred to us, had various invasive devices, had immunosuppressive therapy, and at the end of 30 days, all of them had passed away. So fungal superinfections are really important, and the outcomes are quite bad. Another fungus that brought a lot of attention, and particularly media attention, and was called as the black fungus, and was COVID-associated mucormycosis, to such an extent that the government declared mucormycosis to be a notifiable disease, and we are all reporting cases of mucor. And this was one of the important studies conducted in India. It was a multi-center study, again from different institutions across India, and it is very clearly seen here that in 2020 most of the cases of mucormycosis were in COVID-19 population. They also classified COVID-associated mucormycosis into early and late, early being within 8 days of diagnosis of COVID-19 and late being after 8 days. And as you see clearly here, at a median of 18 days where the diagnosis was made, most of the COVID-associated mucormycosis have come after 8 days of diagnosis. And some of the risk factors that they studied were mainly glucocorticoids and diabetes mellitus in patients who had a CAM versus those who did not have mucor. For the between the early and the late, again, glucocorticoid use was an important risk factor for the late CAMs. And a very important learning was that when corticoids were used inappropriately, naturally, COVID associated mucormycosis did occur. Other systematic reviews also coming from India suggested that male population was predominant. Most of them, 80%, had pre-existing diabetes mellitus. 15% of them came with concomitant diabetic ketoacidosis, and corticosteroid intake was seen as about 76% of these patients. So overall, the learning from COVID-associated mucormycosis was that inappropriate corticosteroid use leading to subsequent improper sugar control were some of the main reasons for developing COVID-associated mucormycosis here in India. The next important fungus which is also caused a secondary infection was the pulmonary aspergillosis. And both globally as well as here in India, cases have been described. And this is a series of 10 cases where more than 50 years are involved, more males, diabetes being an important comorbidity. Microbiology played an extremely important role both in terms of cultures and biomarkers, and we'll see more about this later on. And radiologically, both single as well as multiple cavitatory lesions were seen in all the 10 cases. So invasive pulmonary aspergillosis is also an important secondary infection that is seen with COVID. So apart from bacterial and fungal, a variety of viruses have also been described, but bacterial and fungal superinfections have been the most important in COVID-19. Now, how does microbiology have a role to play in both the diagnosis and optimizing treatment outcomes of superinfections? So a high degree of suspicion, both at the level of the clinical team and the bedside, as well as within the microbiology lab, is essential, so that we will identify and advise onto what kind of cultures are required, what kind of specimens need to be sent, what kind of media needs to be used. So blood cultures and site-specific cultures play an extremely important role. Microscopy, both stained and unstained preparations are quite supportive to early diagnosis. A lot of biomarkers have been used, and we look at some of the fungal biomarkers, and molecular methods have supported the basic culture-based methods in order to improve rapid diagnosis of these infections. Now we look at two techniques. One is the biomarkers and blood cultures, because these play an extremely important role when it comes to diagnosis of superinfections in COVID-19. So the fungal antigens are basically cell wall components which can be detected from blood, urine, or respiratory specimens. Commonly, ELISA techniques are used, and the two most common antigens used are beta-D-glucan and galactomannan. Of course, cryptococcal antigen is also fairly commonly used. Antigen detection methods are basically inexpensive, they are rapid, and can be used by personnel with limited training. So as I mentioned, the two most common fungal biomarkers that we've used during this COVID-19 pandemic have been beta-D-glucan and galactomannan for detection of fungal superinfections. Now, these are basically polysaccharide cell wall components coming from fungi, and galactomannan is specifically for Aspergillus cell walls. Beta-D-glucan is positive both for Candida as well as Aspergillus, whereas galactomannan is only positive for Aspergillus. But there are other fungi also which we need to know can be positive for beta-D-glucan, like Pneumocystis xyrovicii, Histoplasma, Fusarium, Acremonium, Scedosporium. Galactomannan is positive again in Fusarium, Penicillium, Histoplasma, Blastomyces, Bacillomyces, as well as Cryptococcus. So it's important to know these because they can come as false positive, and one should not miss them, because treatment strategies are very different. They're negative in mucorales, and both of them are negative in mucorales. And this is a very important point that we must note, because if you're suspecting an invasive fungal infection and beta-D-glucan and galactomannan are both negative, mucoral should be the topmost differential diagnosis. Naturally, the clinical presentation also should support. The sensitivity and specificity from serum beta-D-glucan is very varied, and the specificity becomes higher with invasive fungal infections. With galactomannan, it's approximately 80% for invasive aspergillosis. Bal galactomannan does not seem to differentiate between invasion and colonization, and one must remember this because a lot of aspergillus can also be a colonizer, and naturally this sensitivity decreases with mold active antifungal agents and non-neutropenic patients. It's very important for us to know where all both of these can come as false positives. So IVIGG, albumin, and other blood products for both of them. A lot of antimicrobial agents like penicillins or piperacillin, tazobactam, amoxicillin, clavulanic acid, use of hemodialysis with cellulose membranes. Most of the membranes now are synthetic, and therefore, we don't see the false positives. But cellulose filters, which when used for IV administrations, gauze packing for serosal surfaces would be an important point to note. And infections with other pathogens like nocardia and mycobacteria, which also have beta-D-glucan in their cell walls, might come as false positive for beta-D-glucan. When it comes to galactomannan, again, IVIGG and IV blood products, plasma light for BAL solutions, or food contaminated with aspergillus or other closely related fungi, and frozen ice pops in the settings of GVHD can cause false positives. So it's extremely important to know where these two biomarkers can be positive and true positive as well as falsely positive. Now, this is an excellent picture coming from the ISHAM guidelines for diagnosis of kappa. That is COVID-associated pulmonary aspergillosis. And as you see here, for possible, probable, as well as proven kappas, microbiology plays the central role, whether it is culture, whether it is a galactomannan, or whether it's beta-D-glucan or microscopy. Microbiology laboratory has a central role to play when it comes to diagnosis and management of kappa. With the biomarkers, the next important set of tests would be cultures, and site-specific cultures, whether it's urine, whether it's respiratory tract, whether it is blood. These are very, very important, and the use of appropriate media based upon the type of secondary infection that one is suspecting is also important to isolate the pathogens. Now, blood cultures remain the gold standard for diagnosis of both bacterial as well as yeast infections. And despite this, many a times people forget to do blood cultures, and this is one practice that needs to be changed. Upfront, at any point in time when you suspect an invasive infection, one must ensure that blood cultures are sent before starting any antimicrobial therapy. And these blood cultures provide isolates for further drug susceptibility testing, which can help in targeted therapies. And there are methods now where rapid ID and drug-resistant gene detection can also support blood cultures in optimizing therapy in patients who have sepsis. And advisory notes like this with the certain other biomarkers that are available to us can help in optimizing the sensitivity of blood cultures. Most of us use automated blood culture systems, and naturally it allows use of a variety of media, allows the growth of a lot of common as well as fastidious organisms, allows sterile body fluids to be inoculated, and brings in ease of workflow as well as better patient outcomes. I'm going to be describing the BACTEC blood culture systems, where a lot of bottles are available, both standard as well as resin containing, and the type of media that one would choose would be depending upon the suspected etiology. Also note that a variety of specimens can be inoculated into these bottles. It could be blood, bone marrow, CSF, ascitic fluid, synovial fluid, and pleural fluid. So paucibacillary specimens, if they are inoculated into blood culture bottles, naturally the sensitivity of these blood cultures or the sensitivity of organism identification improves. Now, what's important is that these blood culture bottles have resins in them, and these resins can be the white and the black resins. The white resins bind to the hydrophobic region of the antimicrobials like beta-lactams and vancomycin, which we commonly use especially in the critical care settings. Black resins are cation exchange resins that absorb positively charged antimicrobials like aminoglycosides, which also we use fairly commonly. The mechanical action of these resins allows to break the RBCs as well as WBCs, thereby releasing the intracellular bacteria. They also bind to toxic substances that are present in the blood, and they neutralize about 14 classes of antimicrobial agents, 10 classes of anti-cancer drugs, and 4 classes of antifungal agents, which makes the resin concept improve the sensitivity of our blood culture bottles. So there are aerobic bottles which could be pediatric and adult. The pediatric bottles one can inoculate as low as 0.5 to 1 ml. There is a mycoaphylitic blood culture bottle which is non-selective, and it is optimized for the recovery of both Candida, the yeast, as well as the filamentous fungi. And for mycobacteria, it has a 42-day protocol where blood can be directly inoculated. And this is an important addition which could be made for patients who are immunocompromised or where you suspect bloodstream infections, particularly in immunocompromised. The anaerobic lytic bottle is a new bottle that again is known to have faster detection times than the standard anaerobic media, and it is best for the recovery of facultative anaerobic bacteria as well as strict anaerobes. And important to note is that a lot of bacterial infections during COVID were caused by Klebsiella pneumoniae and E. coli, which are actually facultative anaerobes. Another important bottle that we have used is the Mycosis ICF medium, which contains antibiotics to inhibit the bacterial growth. It contains selective nutrients to favor fungal growth, and it contains saponin, which actually breaks or causes lysis of the cells, which leads to a faster turnaround time. And this medium has shown to have significant superiority in isolation of yeasts, even with low fungal load bottles. And this is therefore important in the COVID associated candidiasis scenario, where the load can be less and there can be, in fact, polymicrobial organisms also growing. How do we make the best of our blood cultures? Naturally, the old concepts of increasing volumes or greater volumes, increasing the sensitivity still remain. As you see here, the more volume that you use, 40 to 60 ml, the threshold of detection is much more quicker. And the timing of blood cultures, the moment one suspects a sepsis or a bacteremia or a candidemia to be present, please go ahead and collect additional sets of blood cultures. 40 to 60 ml per set is very important. One could select from different types of bottle depending upon what kind of patient. If there is an immunocompromised patient, add a mycoaphylitic or a mycosis ICF in addition to the aerobic and anaerobic media. Volume, we have seen, is very important. Greater the volume in the first go itself, better is the sensitivity of having a positive culture. Skin antisepsis cannot be overlooked. We use chlorhexidine as the skin antiseptic agent, and unless thorough skin antisepsis is done, the chances of blood culture contamination is very high, and therefore having dedicated teams and closed phlebotomy practice would help in improvising the sensitivity and recovery of organisms from blood cultures. So our strategy at Breach Candy is basically we have a high degree of suspicion to super infections right from the start, particularly in those patients who have multiple comorbidities, who are critically ill and who are immunocompromised. This is at both the ends, both the clinical team at the bedside as well as microbiology. Minimum of 2 sets of blood cultures are sent in any patient who belongs to this group, and it could be right hand and left hand, it could be central line and from a peripheral site, and bottles get added based upon the suspected etiology. Site specific cultures sent prior to antimicrobial therapy, and proactive collaboration between the microbiology team and the clinical team is what we practice, and that has helped us improve our bloodstream infection rates and helped us optimize the management of patients with both bacteremias and fungemias. So finally, to conclude, immune dysregulation is a hallmark of COVID-19 moderate and severe disease. Super infections are an important cause of mortality in COVID-19, and they can be prevented by appropriate use of immunomodulatory agents, strict adherence to infection control and antimicrobial stewardship protocols. It's very important to send appropriate laboratory investigations. Microbiology laboratory remains at the forefront in diagnosing as well as managing super infections. So be it biomarkers or be it blood cultures or other site-specific cultures, please send these specimens so that the laboratory is able to support both in the diagnosis as well as the management of super infections. With that, I would like to thank you all for your patient hearing. Thank you.